The Ogre Kingdoms. Great monstrous infantry of all types, supported by good missile power and amazing powerful cavalry, with some gnoblars, little gnoblars to support. The Ogre Kingdoms charge fiercely into battle to overcome their enemies by sheer brute force. So in this video, I will show you every unit from the roster before and after research, redline skills and XP. I will also show you the lords and heroes and their abilities in campaign. So your army has the advantages of having great monstrous infantry, great missiles, great monstrous cavalry, and good single entities. However, they have some disadvantages, namely their poor infantry choices, lacks flying units, and lacks the numbers. For the most part, they are only large entities. For specific abilities, nearly all Ogre units have the Wall Breaker ability, allowing the unit to attack and destroy walls in melee, of course, useful in sieges. And then we have the Ogre Charge. So this implies that when attacking braced charge defenders, they only lose half of their charge bonus. So you always do some charge bonus, which is excellent. Just make sure that you're always charging your ogres so that you take maximum advantage of this ability as well. So in terms of battle abilities, you're going to have the Dismember army ability. This is an area hex, quite a lot of range actually, so it will affect a lot of enemies if you're careful with its positioning, reducing their acceleration, their speed and charge speed, making them much more vulnerable to your attack. Then we have the Massacre army ability, which affects allies, in this case giving them more armor-piercing weapon damage, more base weapon damage, and making them cause terror, which is always nice. Then we have the Butcher ability, which is a very important heal per second. It has a lot of heal, so it's a regeneration ability and also gives some vigor per second, so affecting only one ally, but of course it's a very massive regeneration spell, which is really good for the ogres. How do you get these? Well, you capture prisoners. So prisoners' points are gained by killing enemy units that are either routing or shattered. So for the ogres, while you're fighting, it's still very important that you try to chase enemy units so that this can enhance, and of course you can gain these battle abilities to use and change the course of the battle. And starting your lords with Grease's Gold Tooth. Basically, tons of hit points. He's quite a large entity with tons of mass, actually, so that's the strength of this character. Not a lot of armor, decent leadership, actually. Not a lot of speed or even charge bonus, but you do benefit from it, so make sure that you try to use that. Good melee attack, actually excellent, with some magical attacks, which is always nice, and not a lot of melee defense. So basically, he's quite squishy, he's good at dishing out damage, but he's going to take damage as well. Best idea here is that he does cause armor-piercing weapon strength for the most part, and has bonuses versus large, so he's good against other large entities for sure. Remember that, like most ogres and ogres on the list, he also has Wall Breaker, he also has Ogre Charge. So overall, he's quite good at taking down enemy large entities, of course, but you might need some support, as he can be clunky, especially with the animations as well, but still quite a powerful lord. So in campaign, Greases has the Everyone Has Their Price ability. This is a hex, reducing enemy leadership by -8 and melee attack by -24. He can also get the Snacks, which is a regeneration ability whenever he is in combat. He also gets from his quests the Scepter of Titans, an armor-piercing weapon damage buff with the bonuses versus large increase. And then we also have the passive ability Over Tyrant's Crown, which affects all allies in range with a ward save of 10% and immunity to psychology. And your second choice for Legendary Lord is Scrag the Slaughterer. He's a wizard, a spellcaster, but overall he's still quite decent in melee, especially against infantry units, because he does have that bonuses versus infantry, plus the weapon strength being mainly armor piercing. So his weaknesses: low armor and very low melee defense, basically. He does have a nice speed, nice charge bonus, and good melee attack to compensate there. So, like most of the ogre characters, better in offense than in in defense. In terms of his spells, he does have the Lore of the Great Maw, very useful as well, especially with the ogres. So overall, he's good at being, in the back, using his spells, and then just engaging in the front line, perhaps any weaker units so that you don't make him into a target. But overall, very good supportive caster and melee lord for your forces. So in campaign, Scrag has the extra ingredients, giving him some power recharge and reserves per second whenever he's engaged in melee. He also gets a summon ability called the Gorger Onslaught. This of course summons, as it says in the name, a unit of Gorgers, which is really good. And then we have the Cauldron of the Great Maw. Now this is an area regeneration effect that has infinity effect, but only affects Gorger units, as it states there. So this effect increases whenever there's a kill made by the unit, so it will act as both a replenishment effect, some regeneration there, and a base weapon damage and armor piercing weapon damage buff up to 20%. The Tyrant is a much better lord actually in combat overall, mostly because he's quite heavily armored. So he does have a lot of armor, decent hit points as well, decent speed and charge bonus, great melee attack, and, well, still the reduced melee defense, it's their weakness basically. He also causes mainly armor piercing damage, so he's still quite a nice frontliner, and he's good against enemy lords, of course. Just be wary of those that have bonuses versus large, of course. So overall, a decent choice for leading your forces. So in campaign, the Tyrant can also get the Snacks, this passive ability that is a regeneration ability when he is in melee. And your final choice for a lord is the Slaughtermaster, either of Beasts or of the Great Maw. So basically a spellcaster lord. Not a lot of armor, but he does have a nice shield, so he's a little bit more defended against small arms fire, of course. Decent combat stats, more focused on the defensive side actually this time, so he's kind of like a spellcaster that can survive a little bit on his own, with a higher melee defense than melee attack. Decent speed and charge bonus, so you can still charge him in for finishing off some enemies. Just make sure that you know what you're doing, because of course it's not like he's the best in single combat. Then he does have armor piercing weapon strength, which is much better than other spellcasters, so overall the ogres actually have decent spellcasters that can survive in melee overall. So a very good lord that you can use if you wish to have someone with a little bit of a backline support for a lord. Just keep him out of harm's way while he casts his spells and assists the army, and then finishes them off in the later stages of the battle. So in terms of abilities in the campaign, the Slaughtermasters can get the extra ingredients, giving them power recharge in reserves per second when engaged in melee, and they can also choose to have the regeneration ability, which of course gives them health per second and a weakness to fire damage. And for your heroes, we have the Fire Belly. He's a spellcaster. He does have the Lore of Fire, which is always nice to have. It's always a very good one. He's still a large entity, decent hit points, so he's kind of better than other spellcasters in melee, of course. He does have magical attacks and flaming attacks, good melee attack, but not a lot of armor or melee defense, so don't expect him to survive too long. Maybe against other spellcasters he can do. He does have armor piercing weapon damage, which that's great. It does help out, but still you should always keep them away and just enforce the spells that they have available. Note that because he is the Fire Belly, he does have a fire resistance of 40%, which is always nice. It helps him survive a little bit against anyone with fire attacks. In campaign, in terms of abilities, the Fire Belly can get Fire Breath. It's a magic missile, not a lot of range and low armor piercing damage. And then he also gets Flame Incarnate, which is a melee damage reflection, 2 charges of this spell. And then we also have Eruption. It's an explosion spell, no armor piercing, just fire and magical damage, and a low radius, only 1 charge. The Hunter is a missile hero, basically a nice missile specialist. So he is quite a decent melee combatant, not a lot of armor or any shield, so they're still squishy, these ogres, but still good melee attack and decent melee defense, decent weapon strength with the bonuses versus large as well, with armor piercing, and also the same in terms of the missile strength. He does shoot a nice harpoon based weapon, and it does a lot of damage from afar, not too much afar, so he doesn't have a lot of range, but still it's great to, you know, give some damage to the enemy while they're approaching and then finish them off in melee. So overall, if you do try to finish them off in melee, make sure that you benefit from that speed and charge bonus, which he does have. So overall, a very nice missile specialist for your armies, and later on he can even get a mount, so it's really good for your forces. In terms of abilities in campaign, the Hunter has the Loner passive ability, so whenever friendly units are not in the ability range, he gets more speed and leadership. It's quite nice. Then he also gets the Crippling Throw ability. So this is a magic missile with tons of armor-piercing damage, actually, causing the enemy to also be crippled with reduced speed and melee defense. 3 charges of this magic missile. Next, we have the Butcher. We do have the version with the lore of the Great Maw, or the lore of Beasts. So this one is with the lore of the Great Maw. So he's a decent melee combatant. So same thing with the Firebelly. Not a lot of armor or melee defense, but good melee attack and decent leadership, and still an armor-piercing weapon strength. So he's not as good in combat as the Firebelly, but he can still survive against at least other spellcasters. So, and still with that nice charge bonus, make sure that if you're going to engage with him, make sure it's not defensively, that you make him charge at least to get the most out of him. Still, the main purpose of this gentleman here is to cast spells, of course, so keep him away from any fights if possible. So in campaign, the Butcher can get extra ingredients, which is a power recharge and reserves per second increase while he's engaged in melee, and he also has the opportunity to get regeneration, basically just health per second and a weakness to fire damage. First infantry, we have Gnoblars. Not really an infantry, this is just exactly as it states there, a meat shield. They are a spear infantry, but no bonuses versus large, so don't count on that. For the most part, this is one of the only units that I would say it's always the same. It is always about just soaking enemy charges, soaking enemy missiles, so that your ogres can be free to, you know, do their damage and have no damage while these guys are taking the damage. That's the purpose of a meat shield. Now in the late game, the same thing, even though they get a little bit of increased stats, nothing to write home about. So overall, the only good thing is that actually they do overcome their weakness in terms of the leadership, but other than that, they're always a meat shield. That's how you should always treat them. The first actual unit and the template for all ogres, really, it's the Ogre Bulls. Now, they don't have a lot of armor or melee attack or melee defense. They rely instead on their speed, charge bonus, and weapon strength, which does have a considerable amount of armor piercing damage. So basically, because they all have the Ogre charge, they benefit greatly from that charge bonus, which you should always be doing. Just try not to be defensive with any Ogre units, because you will waste that charge bonus, which they really need to overcome their enemies. Now in the late game, if you're in a rush, you may, or without too much funds, you can still rely on them. They do gain a lot of bonuses in terms of melee attack and weapon strength and charge bonus, so overall they'll still do much more damage, much more that glass cannon idea, but don't count them again on surviving too long. You know, poor leadership, poor armor, poor melee defense, that will still happen. So overall, always a kind of a glass cannon one-shot unit to use in either the early game or the late game. And a basic improvement to the Ogre Bulls, it's the Ogre Bulls with dual weapons. Pretty much the same stats really, poor melee attack and melee defense with a good speed, charge bonus and weapon strength, but the advantage is that these guys have a bonus versus infantry. So now you know what their main purpose is, to wreck enemy infantry lines, or to even go through them to try and reach their ranged units. This is quite a nice unit to try and do so. Just make sure that you don't count on them surviving too long because of that poor poor armor and poor melee defense. Now, in the late game, of course, you can still field a couple of these guys, and definitely it will be my choice of a cheaper unit that can still do a lot of damage, especially with that melee attack and weapon strength improvement and charge bonus. By all means, they'll do a lot of damage, just don't count them on surviving too long. In case you want more of a holding infantry of sorts, not really holding infantry, we'll get there. So, decent armor, you know, they start getting a little bit more armor because they do have that shield, that glove acts like a shield, a bronze shield, which is nice, blocking some missile fire, and they do get much better melee defense values. So overall, these guys can survive a little bit, but of course, they're still the same principle. They're still relying on their speed, that weapon strength, which does have, you know, the same amount of armor-piercing weapon damage, and the nice charge bonus to do their main damage. The only difference is that these guys maybe can go in front, getting all those missiles focused on them so that your other units can survive better and do their damage. Now, in the late game, if you're in a pinch, if you're facing enemies with a lot of ranged units, by all means, bring a couple of these guys. They're cheap, and of course, with that melee attack, weapon strength, and charge bonus advancements, they'll do just nicely. So overall, of course, you'll have better units, but when you're in a rush to hire some good units, don't forget that you do have this possibility. If you want a great improvement over the Ogre Bulls, then we have the Iron Guts. Heavily armored, they do have much better leadership, melee attack and melee defense. Now it's in the average value, so it's quite decent, especially for ogres. Then we have a great amount of armor piercing weapon strength with a small bonuses versus infantry, but never forget the same principle, speed and charge bonus. This is what you're going to be using, so make sure that you charge these guys in. Now, something to note is that contrary to the others, which are 24 models, this is only 16 models, so be careful with that. Now, note that this also implies that by each model has a lot more hit points, so these guys are really tanky. In the late game, of course, you can still use a couple of these guys, definitely, especially considering that armor that they have, the leadership, and the weapon strength improvements and overall melee attack and melee defense. You can field tons of these guys just as a sort of holding infantry. Just remember that they're never holding infantry. You should always be charging with the ogres. That's their main principle, charge. That's the main idea that the whole army relies about, is in charging. If you don't charge with the ogres, you're gonna be losing some battles. Now to the elite part of the ogres, we have the man-eaters. Now these guys, decent armor, but still nothing like the Iron Guts, definitely. Very good melee attack and melee defense values, and very good weapon strength, which is also armor piercing. Still the same reliance on the charge bonus and the speed. Do note that these guys are also immune to psychology. So that is excellent for them. These guys, definitely a great addition to your forces. You can have a couple of these guys all the time, and they'll do just nicely for you, at least until you get something better, as you'll see next. In the late game, they get a lot of good bonuses, including more armor, much more melee attack and defense values, as well as great weapon strength and some slight missile resistance. All of this helps solidifying this as a very staple unit. Of course, this is the basic unit, and every single other unit of man-eaters is kind of improved upon this basic unit. If you wish for a little bit more survival, then the man-eaters with Iron Fists. They do have that bronze shield, which is excellent. It will help them against enemy missiles, and of course across the board the same typical stats, but increased melee defense really helps. So that charge bonus, that speed, it's always the same idea. Make sure that you're charging these guys still, and especially useful when the enemy has a ton of ranged units. So overall, just plan these guys against whoever brings, or typically brings, like the elves, for instance, or Cathay, and make sure that you have a couple of these guys to soak those missiles. Now in the late game, they do become much better armor, to the point that it's quite considerable. You know, 60 is a good number. Much better melee attack and melee defense values, and weapon strength, as well as that missile resistance. Overall, very good unit to soak enemy missiles. But sometimes all that you wish is to have a unit that can actually counter itself. So man-eaters with great weapons, the main idea is that they are anti-large, as you can see there, and they do have quite a nice armor-piercing damage with that bonus versus large. These guys are great at defeating other monstrous infantry, other cavalry units. They're great at destroying single entities, even lords or mounts. So overall, that's the main purpose of these guys. Remember that you don't have as much melee defense or, you know, the benefit of the shield as the other man-eaters. So having a couple of these guys just to go after those targets while the others soak is much better. Decent speed and charge bonus, of course, make sure that you charge them in so they can get that bonus in. Now, in the late game, definitely you can field a lot of these guys in any army because of that increased melee attack, melee defense, weapon strength, missile resistance, even a little bit more armor to survive. So overall, a wonderful addition to any force. The first missile unit, the Gnobler Trappers. So basically this is a hybrid unit, just an improvement of the regular Gnoblers with a range attack. Not a lot of range in that, so it's kind of like a skirmisher unit. That's basically how you should use it. It does have Vanguard deployment and it has Stalk. Sadly, it doesn't have fire whilst moving, that would be great. But it does have a nice ability. Gnobler Traps, this is a hex that causes reduced speed, and charge bonus, which already would be excellent, and it still causes damage per second. Yes, it has like a kind of a mortis engine effect. So, in the late game, you can still field a couple of these guys, especially because of that ability, because that's the main principle of them. To stop enemies on their tracks, while your main units, your ogres, your crushers, your cavalry, whatever, can do the damage, you know, can charge in and do a lot of damage. And they do get a nice speed bonuses, so this makes them much better skirmishers overall in the late game. And now to a Regiment of Renown, the Bogglers of the Mad Marchers. The Gnoblers, Regiment of Renown, still with that ranged attack, and it does cause poison, which is much better. Their melee attacks also cause poison, so overall that's their improvement. But wait, there's more. They also have a weird regeneration. They have regeneration when the unit is in water. So basically, if it's kind of like a difficult ability to spot when you can use, but if you can manage that, then these guys definitely can survive for quite some time, doing that damage in poisoning the enemies, so that overall your ogres and other units can do their job much better. And a great missile unit, the Lead Belchers, a monstrous cannon infantry, the one and only. So they do have tons of damage, especially with that nice range, so a lot of armor piercing damage. That's exactly what we want from these guys. Overall, their stats, they're nothing to write home about. They're like Ogre Bulls stats, so they can still survive decent enough, but they don't have as much charge bonus or speed because of course they're carrying that massive cannon. Overall, these guys, they're great additions to any roster. You can field a lot of these guys, especially in the late game, with improved stats overall in their missile department. So more range, more ammunition, more missile strength. That's exactly what we want for these guys. Of course, they can still hold on a little bit in melee, but that's not their main purpose. Main purpose, just shoot the hell out of them. And the nice missile infantry, the man-eaters with ogre pistols. So overall, these are just regular man-eaters with ranged attack, with a nice armor-piercing ranged attack, with decent range as well. So these are kind of like a staple in your armies. You could bring a couple of these, a lot of these guys actually, together with some lead belchers and some ogres in the front, and you'll do a lot of damage, especially in the late game with their improved stats. But note, their stats, the stats that are improved for these guys are the melee stats. So overall, they'll just survive much better. They'll be like a front line. They can actually shoot. So a hybrid unit for sure, solidifying that principle there. They are a hybrid unit. The lead belchers, are mostly the missile infantry that you would want. Now to a Regiment of Renown, the Powder Guts, man-eaters, ogre pistols with some good old-fashioned sense, and some increased stats overall. But the main idea here, some increased stats that are not immediately noticeable. Their range that is increased, and the missile strength is also much more powerful. And in addition, what they have is a nice ability here, adaptive tactics. This means that they can affect allies with melee defense and melee attack if they are losing melee combat, which is great. So overall, this is excellent to ensure that if you're losing a combat, well, then suddenly they can turn the tables on the enemy. Overall, a wonderful addition to your rosters. The first cavalry unit, the Mournfang Cavalry. A nice monstrous cavalry. All of the cavalry from the ogres, of course, are monstrous. So very good armor, decent melee attack, poor melee defense, so they're much better on offense, of course. Very nice speed with a good charge bonus, so overall that's how you should do the damage with these guys. Of course, taking advantage of that armor-piercing weapon strength, and that's a lot of weapon strength as well. So overall, now you know how to do damage with these guys. Just charge them in, make sure that benefit from that, and be reasonable when trying to keep them in melee, of course, because of that poor melee defense. Now in the late game you can still definitely field a lot of these guys, especially in a pinch. Just recruit a couple of them. Because of that armor piercing, they'll always be effective, but note how their main idea is always under that speed, weapon strength and charge bonus, because those are the main increased stats. Of course, melee attack also increases, which is nice, but that melee defense is still rather poor. If instead you want a cavalry unit that can actually survive against missiles, and if you're facing, like the elves or Cathay or something like that, definitely Mournfang Cavalry with Iron Fists. That's because they will gain that bronze shield, of course surviving a little bit there, still the same stats across the board, just better melee defense, so overall these guys can definitely be classed as a melee cavalry. You can charge them in, of course benefit from that speed and charge bonus, but then leave them there, especially in the late game. That's where I would use them as such. These guys suddenly change from that typical charge idea or shock cavalry idea to a more melee based cavalry. So overall they can still be squishy. Note that there are only 12 units, of course, but definitely much better than the regular Mournfang Cavalry in that role. And if you're looking for someone that can actually bring the enemy cavalry down, well, the Mournfang Cavalry with great weapons. Of course, with that anti-large, still armor-piercing damage, which is always nice. A good speed and good charge bonus, but of course, weakness in terms of melee defense. And of course, the number of units. Always remember, they do have nice mass, but they are only 12 units per unit, so be careful. Overall, in the late game, you can still definitely use these guys, but of course, always relying with that charge bonus, with that speed, with that weapon strength. Do a lot of damage really fast, otherwise get out of there. So overall, a nice addition to your ogre units. If you want to start into the elite cavalry, then the Crushers with Iron Fists. Of course, as it says, heavily armored with that bronze shield, which is excellent. They do have a nice weapon strength improved with a lot of armor piercing, so these guys do a lot of damage, especially that high melee attack and decent charge bonus with speed. So overall, you now know how to use these guys. Of course, they're much more reliant in melee than the regular Mournfang Cavalry. Of course, much better over there, but still a shock cavalry overall. Now, in the late game, definitely they changed that, because they can become a reliable melee cavalry for sure. You can charge them in and leave them there, because they'll do a lot of damage. They have high leadership, high armor, decent melee defense. It almost reaches 50, and with that increased weapon strength and charge bonus, well, not a lot will be staying there after they do their damage. So overall, a wonderful addition for any elite ogre army. But if you're still not happy and you wish to really crush the enemy cavalry, Crushers with great weapons. These guys can dominate any battlefield. You can put them against Grail Knights, you can put them against Blood Knights, anything. They'll demolish them. So especially with that charge bonus, so ensure that you manage to do the charge, otherwise they'll be really squishy. Poor melee defense, but decent melee attack, armor, speed and charge bonus, as well with that weapon strength, which does have that bonus versus large. Late game, definitely just bring a couple of these guys to cover your flanks, because they'll do whatever is necessary from them. Especially always taking into account that charge bonus. If you're not charging with the ogres overall, you're losing on a lot of damage, so make sure that you use that. Now for a Regiment of Renown, the Sky Striders, Crushers with Great Weapons Regiment. So overall the same thing as the Crushers with Great Weapons, but with magical attacks and Frostbite. So good luck running away from these guys. Whoever they hit, they're going to be there for a long time until they die. Overall, they also have a nice missile resistance of 20%, so to the enemy is going to be difficult to take these guys down. Of course, they have a lot of armor, not any missile resistance, or no shield, for instance, but still, with that 20% missile resistance, they can survive a little bit. Make sure that you charge them in, and these guys can defeat anyone on the battlefield, especially if they are, of course, a large target with that anti-large bonus. The Saber-Tusk pack, a nice addition to the roster actually, especially because of their speed. They're really quick on their feet, and they do have a nice weapon strength. Not a lot of armor piercing here, but still they'll do a lot of damage. Their speed is the main advantage. You can get these guys anywhere that you wish to quickly overcome maybe enemy artillery, for instance, or ranged units. That's their main purpose. Of course, under a hunter, these guys can get a lot of bonuses, so make sure that you bring a hunter along. Now, they do have rampage, so be careful. They may be prone to just staying there and fighting the enemy on the worst conditions possible, so be careful with those guys. So in the late game, definitely you can field them in the same manner, just with better stats, of course, especially with better speed and more charge bonus and more weapon strength. So overall, a wonderful addition to any early to mid game roster. Now to a more tactical option for the ogres, the Gorgers. Basically a nice anti-infantry armor-piercing unit with a lot of weapon strength there as well, decent charge bonus and speed, but the advantage of these guys is those abilities. Vanguard deployment, they have stalk, they are unbreakable, and they have frenzy. So overall, now you see how you can use these guys. Definitely in the late game you can still use them the same way, especially because they'll be much more powerful. Charge bonus increased, weapon strength greatly increased, more melee attack, even a little bit slightly more armor. So overall these guys will deliver a nasty surprise to the enemies, and they're definitely a nice unit to use in any ogre roster. Now to a unit that everyone recognizes, the Giant. So overall, single entity, not a lot of armor, great melee attack, poor melee defense, so it's much better on the offense, very good weapon strength, so these guys can dish out a ton of damage when used properly. They do have nice missile resistance and they do cause terror, so overall these guys are great against any targets, but overall very weak against enemy missiles, so be careful with that. In the late game these guys get much better overall, decent armor, much better melee attack, great weapon strength, and especially particularly that missile resistance, making them a little bit more resistant to their weakness, which is something nice. So overall you can bring a couple of these guys in your armies just to overcome enemy single entities, and they'll do just nicely. And yet another single entity, this monster is called the Stonehorn. Heavily armored, great health pool, actually it's kind of nice whenever it approaches 10k. Decent speed and charge bonus, so as any ogre unit you should always rely on that, but very poor melee defense. So it's rather squishy, don't get it enveloped, keep it running like a chariot really. And like a chariot it's gonna hit like a truck because of that weapon strength, decent weapon strength with armor piercing and a bonuses versus infantry. So now you know how you should use them against enemy infantry lines, take care of them, and well, just take care of the Stonehorn and he'll take care of the enemy infantry, especially late game with improved stats altogether, which is always nice. You know, more armor, leadership, more speed, more charge bonus, everything is increased, which is always nice, except of course that melee defense, it's always squishy, so be careful with these guys. And now to a Regiment of Renown, a very cool looking one, the Snowhorn of Morn. So overall improved stats over the regular Stonehorn with Frostbite, so good luck running away from this guy, that's their main usage. In addition to that they do have a Glacial Defense, which reduces its speed but heavily increases their armor and missile resistance. So overall if you're under attack by a lot of enemy missiles, just pop that in and they will do just nicely. Overall a great unit to actually overcome the enemy front line and then go into the enemy back line and do tons of damage, and they won't be able to flee because of that frostbite, so it's excellent to use in that regard. A nice upgrade from the Stonehorn is the one with the Harpoon Launcher. Overall the same stats as the melee version. I wish this was rather different, so that you have a place for that, because otherwise this one is just better, because it has a 250 range of an armor-piercing missile, which is great. Overall very good at sniping enemy single entities. This is the main usage that I would use them, but of course they're very good against enemy cavalry, enemy infantry. Just make sure that they don't get enveloped because of that poor melee defense. That's their main issue. And of course enemy units that are good anti-large. In the late game you can definitely field a couple of these guys, particularly useful for that artillery style attack, which is excellent, and then to just close in for the kill in melee with much better improved melee stats. Note that there's no improvement overall to their missile attack. The first artillery unit is the Gnobler Scrap Launcher. Basically, as it says, an anti-infantry. It's mostly like a chariot unit, really. It does have decent weapon strength there, but very poor melee attack and melee defense, so it's kind of to be used when all the ammunition has been expended, you know. Overall, really good range with a nice missile strength. It doesn't have a lot of... it doesn't have any armor piercing. Well, it does have some armor piercing, but it's not mainly armor piercing. That's what I was going to say. No other bonuses, but overall a good all-rounder unit to be used. In the late game you can definitely field even a couple of these guys just to go against enemy missile infantry, for instance. That's how I like to use them, but they are very good and accurate against most targets. Overall good improvements on their missile stats overall across the board, as you can see there. And this unit is classed as a siege artillery, and a siege artillery it is. The Iron Blaster, great single entity artillery unit, not a lot in terms of melee stats, but it can still do some damage because of that nice weapon strength. But the main purpose, of course, is that with that ranged attack, which causes a ton of damage, like seriously a ton of damage, which is mainly armor piercing damage as well, and it does have the sundered armor, so great to use against heavily armored targets to reduce their armor, so that your ogres can go in and finish them off. Overall, you can bring a couple of these guys in any late game armies. Look at those improved stats, especially with that added range and reduced reload time. It's great to have a couple of these guys just to maul the enemy infantry units, and then you close in for the kill. And that is it, all the Ogre units before and after Redline skills, research and XP. I hope this helps you out to enjoy the faction a little bit more and prepare different army compositions. That's the sole purpose of this video. So overall, a very nice army. I hope you enjoy playing with them, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.